Yes, sir.
Friends, welcome to Radio Free Cannabis, coming to you from high in the Oakland Hills, overlooking the San Francisco Bay, epicenter and birthplace of the global cannabis freedom movement. Remember, no matter where you are, no matter what country you're in, no matter your race, your nationality, your religion, or the position that you occupy in society, if you love cannabis, if you have a special relationship with this plant, then you are not alone. There are hundreds of millions of us all around the world. Collectively, we are larger than all but the very largest nations. And we understand that none of us will be fully and securely free until all of us are fully and securely free. So if you are still living under the darkness of prohibition, stay strong. Change is coming. Lately, I've been talking a lot and spending a lot of my time thinking about the intersection of racial justice and cannabis. And you can see that work on my social channels on the lastprisonerproject.org website. And I want to talk about race and cannabis today, but from a slightly different kind of perspective. I want to talk about the critical role that Black people have played in the dispersal of cannabis and knowledge about cannabis all around the world. Some of this history is just coming to light now. There's a book that I've been reading that's called The African Roots of Marijuana by Chris Duvall, who's a professor at the University of New Mexico. And Duvall reinterprets cannabis history through an anti-racist and anti-colonial perspective. And he says, he believes, and I think lays out a persuasive case that while cannabis came to North America and the Americas and other parts of the world through many, many different hands of very many different groups, that the largest number of hands, that the single group that was most responsible for this dispersal were Africans and the descendants of Africans who somehow managed to bring cannabis seeds with them under conditions of bondage and then find new homes for cannabis all around the African diaspora. How they managed to do this is an incredible tale of its own. And one day I hope to persuade Professor Duvall to come on the show so that we can more deeply explore it. But other parts of the role that Black people have played in dispersal of cannabis and the creation of cannabis culture have been known for a long time. The role of cannabis and Black people in the creation of jazz, in the creation of reggae, in the creation of hip hop, and then how these various different genres have helped cannabis all around the world. And that's what we're going to be exploring today with our guests, who I am really excited to introduce you to. Niambe McIntosh is the daughter of Peter Tosh. She is a cannabis activist in her own right. She is the director of the Peter Tosh Foundation and of the Peter Tosh brand. And towards the end of the show, we're going to ask Niambe to share with us how the disparate enforcement of cannabis prohibition in the United States has tragically and directly impacted the Tosh family. My other guest is Fab Five Freddy. Fab Five Freddy came to global attention as the VJ, as the host of Yo MTV Raps, where he played a pioneering role in introducing this new art form all around the world. He is a visual artist and a filmmaker. He lives in Harlem, and his one of his more recent projects is Grass is Greener, which is a really remarkable documentary about the history of cannabis and how that history intersects with music, various different musical genres. It's available on Netflix, and if you have not watched it yet and you're watching this show, then you need to remedy that lack and make sure that you go and watch this film. So to both of you, welcome to Radio Free Cannabis.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for being here. Nice to meet Niambe, I'm sorry.
Niambe, yes. Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here with you both. Thank you.
So Niambe, it's we have this unique opportunity with you to really get a firsthand glimpse, understanding of one of the people who was most noted and played the most critical role in spreading cannabis culture around the world, really a global ambassador. Your father, cannabis legend, prophet, songwriter, Peter Tosh. So could you tell us a little bit about what you were taught in your family, what you learned about the role that cannabis played in reggae and Rastafari?
Yeah, when it's a part of your culture, it's a lot of the lessons aren't necessarily taught directly. They're kind of indirectly taught. It's just around. All of that's most of my family consumes cannabis, and it wasn't something that we were ever ashamed of, ever embarrassed of, and it wasn't until I became older where I started to understand it a little bit more, and learn about the medicinal benefits and its history and connection to Rastafari, and how my father was this fearless ambassador of the plant. I grew up kind of just seeing the interviews and the pictures of him always with a spliff in his mouth, no matter what stadium or theater or concert, no matter what country he was in. And you would think that it was easy for him to do those things. But when I meet people that actually traveled with him and toured with him, the amount of experiences that he's had, at airports, particularly even in Jamaica, it wasn't something that was easy for him to do, but he believed, he had a staunch belief in the plant, and he knew that any opposition to his belief was a violation of his human rights. And he would say it back then. So, a lot of what I've learned really has come as I've gotten older, and now look back at, our legacy and the belief system around the plant.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Your father had this image of cannabis warrior. I remember him with the bandoliers and just very militant, right?
Yes.
But he was really a very multi-dimensional human being, wasn't he?
Oh yeah. He was firm in his beliefs and didn't hold his tongue. And there's even the One Love Peace concert that happened in Jamaica in the 70s, and he, in front of the Jamaican government, laid out all of the ways in which they were negatively impacting the economy and oppressing people, even through the education system. So he had this public persona as he was an activist, and he was firm, and he did not hold his tongue, but personally, he was the most lovable and likable man. And my mom said that, whenever you were with him, you would, he'd have you just laughing the whole day, because he was, he was a comedian. Yeah. So very multifaceted, but also well-educated as well. He made a point to learn about the medicinal benefits of cannabis. And I remember watching an interview recently where he used cannabinoid system, back in the 70s, and I'm just like, what the hell? I knew you were smart, but I didn't know that you understood the medicinal benefits and the science behind the plant to that depth. And so he was definitely a man before his time.
Well, we were lucky indeed to have him. And thanks for sharing some of your memories. It's wonderful to hear about. Fred, let's think about jazz for a minute. We know that one of the ways that cannabis came to North America was through the hands of Afro-Caribbean sailors, folks from Trinidad, folks from Jamaica, who were sailing into the port of New Orleans, around 1900, a little before, a little after, right
Yeah.
around the same time that jazz was being born. So were those two things connected?
Yeah, it seems like when you do the history, they were very connected. And even though the racial oppression, slavery, all those things were in effect as they were in most of the states, colonies, et cetera, at that time during this history, there was a little bit of openness, looseness, the ability to let people mix a little. And one of the places where that happened in New Orleans was a place known as Congo Square, where on the weekends, Black people could come out and play the drums and sell some wares. It was like a market festival kind of jam session, if you will, that people gathered and mixed. And that openness allowed the music to develop and create, while those sailors that would come into that major port in that area brought these special goodies that people really developed a liking to, that went along with the development of this music. And some of the first reports against cannabis, primarily because people of color were smoking it and it was bringing people together. Some of the first reports and articles written were based on what was happening in New Orleans. So that's when you see, okay, because Black people, and of course, as you know, in places that bordered Mexico, they were attacking the Mexican people for using cannabis. But as the migration began to the north, after Jim Crow went into effect, Black folks were trying to get away from that continued oppression that was pretty much the same as slavery. So up to Harlem, Chicago, they came, the music continued to develop, and the plant came along with them.
So how did those early jazz musicians relate to cannabis? What role did it play in their creative lives?
Well, I think it was, in my film, talking to people that have put a lot of deep thought into it, the kind of state, that kind of relaxed, blissful vibe that cannabis sometimes puts you in, just in terms of your psychospace and your just physical being, allowed people say the ability, the improvisational aspects of jazz, you were more easily able to move in and around the beats and the rhythms, doing something that wasn't as regimented as the European musics, which the musicians said, okay, I hear what you're saying, playing, I see those instruments, let me take them and do something different. And so that apparently worked to help that improvisational process, which musicians have talked about. And I think also when you think of what we know now of the specific medical benefits, people being treated for all types of things with cannabis, particularly PTSD, which for Black folks now, with what's going on all around us, and you see this terror, which we've had to deal with for way too long, and understanding that there's people that have been in the wars that are being treated with cannabis for PTSD as opposed to the opioids, which they're given, a much better result. So that tells me that back in those times when you move wrong, you step wrong, you could be confronted by the authorities and could end up lynched hanging from a tree, that cannabis probably, the medicinal aspects were probably working in ways that people knew, but now we know more specifically because of the research going on. So I think that was a very much a part. Plus, if you're drunk on alcohol, you're not going to be able to play your instrument with the kind of physical mobility that you really need. And so it all makes perfect sense when you, and then Louie Armstrong, the father, if you will, the great kind of architect of jazz, was the most prolific cannabis user, smoker, advocate throughout. And so we now know more of these things specifically. So it's really been exciting and to learn more about this and feeling and knowing how it actually works.
It is so fascinating, right? That some of the most important pillars of American culture came out of the crucible of racial oppression and cannabis. Mez Mesro, who was a white jazz musician,
Yes.
he actually sold weed to Louie Armstrong,
Yes.
and was a huge cannabis and jazz aficionado,
Yes, he
said
was.
that jazz was the sound that slavery made when, or excuse me, I got that wrong. Jazz is the sound that the blues made when slavery encountered freedom.
I tell you, Mez Mesro was a legend. So I just want to say, so how this all began for me, which I kind of illustrate in the film. As a young kid, I was in a record store. Let me look through some jazz records. You know, my dad played jazz all the time. And there's this album called Reefer Songs. So as a kid, I bought this album and I couldn't believe, like, wait a minute, Duke Ellington, all these jazz greats, Cab Calloway made songs about cannabis. So I come home, my dad and all his friends were gathered. I was like, yo, what's going on? And they all had a big laugh, knew all these songs, and then started telling me stories because I'm trying to decipher the one record in particular, this one song which goes, dreamed about a reefer 5 feet long, the mighty Mez, but not too strong. You'll be high, but not for long, you know. So I was like, whatever. And my dad and them laughed, and they, as kids, had chipped in, went up to Harlem and brought a loose joint from Mez. So they remembered, heard the stories, purchased the plant, and got really, you know, had the best experience. And so that explained, and then when the idea for the film Grass is Greener hit me, I was like, wait a minute, these jazz guys were making these records about the plant, which were, you know, there wasn't on the radio then, but it was in jukeboxes and all the clubs, so everybody knew, hey, this is what we're into. And that, I realized, followed contemporary music through every genre. And then what I did with hip hop when I ran your MTV Raps was introduce people like Snoop, Cypress Hill, Method Man, Redman, which all were the current day major advocates. I thought, what a cool way to tell a story with the music and, you know, take you along that ride from a musical, cultural perspective, as well as looking at all the criminal justice stuff. So that's really was a fascinating, and meeting you literally was great. When the film premiered a year ago on 420, was a screening at that great theater in Oakland, and we met and then we hung out. I was just like elated because I followed your work, Steve, as one of the pioneers in the business, in the activism, and it was like, wow, you were really, I remember when after the film, you were like, wow, thank you. So that made it. And also, I just want to say about your dad, of course, we touch on his amazing, legendary, like just bravery out there, and you know, and as I talked to Damien, he had just talked, you know, about the amazing work your dad did over 40 years ago. That song, Legalize It, was just so heroic. So I remember that as a kid growing up in Bed-Stuy, like, wow, legalize it.
Yeah, when I actually watched the documentary, and kudos, you did a fabulous job with
Thank you.
The documentary. And I had no idea that, I mean, I assumed, I'm like, they better talk about Peter Tosh.
You better believe it.
And so when I watched it, and you know, I know Damian Marley only through Sedella, so I haven't actually had a sit-down opportunity, but then to see him and Janine, really, they did a phenomenal job on really capturing like what it meant to be that my father and his activism, and how impactful that was in society and in the culture.
Yes, he was a real hero for so many of us, and was so ahead of his time, and now proven right as we push through towards, you know, rectifying all this unfortunate hate and misinformation. And now we realize this is so beneficial, as your dad articulated in the song. You know? He broke down the, you know, asthma and
Exactly.
yeah, he broke down. That was so excellent, so great, so ahead of his time.
Well, that's a perfect segue into another strain that I want to weave into this tapestry here, right? last year I had the remarkable good fortune to be able to spend about 200 days traveling to emerging cannabis economies in 4 different continents, from Europe to Africa to South America, and then back to North America. Little stop in Jamaica along the way. And one of the things that I learned in those travels was that all around the world, I would run into these very passionate, super well-educated young activists who were dedicating their lives to the cannabis freedom movement. And more often than not, they would tell me that they were introduced to cannabis. They were introduced to cannabis culture and cannabis thinking and the true facts of cannabis through reggae music. So Niambe, when you were growing up, and even later on in life, first, how did your father feel about this global role, and then how did the awareness of it sort of manifest in your life?
My father was very spiritual, and he really felt like it was his spiritual responsibility to liberate the plant. There's the song Legalize It, but then there's also another song, Bush Doctor, where he talks about, and he's quoted saying like, it can build a failing economy. No longer will you have to duck and hide. It will stop police brutality. So he was very much aware of the impact that cannabis legalization will have, particularly for those that are oppressed. And there's interviews of him saying that everybody smokes cannabis, but it's only the poor that suffer from, prohibition. And so he knew that he would always say like, this is something that is divine. It's a divine. It's in me. It's from creation. This work that I do is I've been here, centuries before this moment. And so growing up, it was something that was just always around me. And people ask, what people don't know, I'm his youngest child. And so when he passed away in 1987, I was actually only 5 years old. And so I didn't grow up with, his teachings and having that father figure to kind of pass on those messages. But it was through his music and through people that knew him and will share stories about how he felt and, and how he there's actually interviews that you can find on social media where he was always a target for police brutality. There's an interview where police came into his house and dragged him out, took a spliff out of his hand as he was rolling it in his home and literally beat him up, broke his ribs. And yet still, even having those experiences, he would get up the next day, he would probably write a song about it and continue to fight because he knew that it was for a greater good and it was coming from a higher power. And I think that cannabis really intunes us all to that, like, there's that spiritual connectivity that you have, and he would call it divine inspiration, because it allows you to, to let go of all of the negativity that you may be experiencing in life, and then be able to create, whether that's just creative thoughts or creative art or music expression, but it would allow you to express yourself in a way that I think that no other experience or substance really can do. And growing up, those are the things that I started to learn and dive into. And I think when cannabis became legal in Colorado in 2014, that's when I was like, okay, it's time for me to really learn about the plant. I just, I knew about spliffs and blunts. I'm from Boston, the inner city. That people just roll spliffs and they smoke blunts. And then I was like, what is dabbing and what is, wax? And even learning about the various ways that people are consuming, in present day. But it started to, when you start to see like Harvard professors and really validating the things that my father was saying in, 1975 about the medicinal benefits. And then you start to see people talking about the impact on the economy. He was very much aware of, hemp and all of its uses. He actually, when he passed away, the book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, was actually in his house and was found in his house. And so he actually, was very much about learning all facets of the plant. And it wasn't about just getting high, but it was really about turning, just changing the world.
That, for me personally, is a really moving fact that you just mentioned that I'd never heard before about the Emperor Wears No Clothes. Right around that time, I had been working on publishing and distributing that book, and
Oh, wow.
so and what was getting me through those battles very often was your father's songs. So it's very interesting this way that the global cannabis culture has developed, where there's been this bringing of cannabis and knowledge about cannabis, the effects of cannabis, backwards and forwards, from communities of color into the white community, and then even vice versa. We've seen with things like The Emperor Wears No Clothes landing in Jamaica. Fred, maybe could you tell us a little bit about the role that that jazz and later hip hop played in this introduction of cannabis from communities of color to white people? We know that Harry Anslinger claimed that one of his motivating reasons for prohibition was this spread. Was that Anslinger's paranoid fantasy, or is that a real thing that's happened?
Yeah, unfortunately, the story of Harry Anslinger, who was the first drug czar in America, sort of like a baby J. Edgar Hoover, very racist, and saw that this music, this popular music, which was really not universally loved at that time, jazz music. A lot of people looked at it as the devil's music, probably can equate it to the worst, the most intense gangster rap. This is how it was depicted heavily at that time, and all the primary artists were vilified and really tortured. And once again, Harry Anslinger saw that this popular music was bringing people together. Like here where I live in Harlem, as this music was developing in the 20s and 30s, like people wanted to come and hear this. That's why the era is known as the Jazz Age. When F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby and coined that term, that's a reflection of the music, the rhythm, the excitement that was going on, and cannabis was a huge part of it. And so Harry Anslinger targeted musicians specifically. The main artists in the genre were focused on, were harassed continually. But then his racism, and this went all the way from the 20s, 30s, when he got cannabis criminalized in 1937, he had influence all the way into the 60s, actually, and also was responsible for the death of Billie Holiday by targeting her and knowing that she was a heroin addict. Everyone knew that. And when a heroin addict is, apprehended, medical treatment was a part of what was supposed to happen. And when he had Billie Holiday arrested, she was handcuffed to her hospital bed. They gave her no treatment, where she died. So this guy was the evil kind of person that really is responsible for a lot of what we're trying to unravel to this day. And he saw that the jazz musicians were deeply involved in using the cannabis plant for all the same reasons that Peter Tosh and all these pioneers laid out for us clearly in a more of a modern era. And, once again, cutting edge, revolutionary musicians all kind of learned from each other and dived into similar things and understood those benefits. And that traveled all the way into hip hop. It was just a synergistic connection with the vibe that the plant allows you to have, and creators are able to create even more so when the cannabis just eases all those tensions psychoactively, and great music that we're thankful for, you know. Yeah, it's just an amazing history to learn. I mean, had I been given more episodes, I would have gotten into other artists, like other R&B artists, like even in the DeAngelo, who had this amazing record, Brown Sugar, back in the 90s. That really was a Cannabis song. And, you know, Rick James, who made a record called Mary Jane, you know, that was a Cannabis song. And so I had also planned to interview George Clinton, and the idea would have been to take him to the African American Smithsonian Museum, where the mothership actually is, interview him there to get P-Funk studies, because George not only did cannabis, but he did psychedelics as well. So it's fascinating musical connection that is why we've got, a part of why we've had so much great music, because so many great artists indulged in the plant, and as they rightfully should. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of that.
So what a beautiful pattern, another thread of this tapestry, the way that cannabis in different places at different times for different people has sparked the creative impulse, and the way that that spirit of cannabis, that spirit of freedom, that spirit of experimentation, playfulness, improvisation, freedom that goes along with cannabis has manifested in these really critically important art forms. I mean, where would our world be today if we didn't have jazz music, if we didn't have reggae music, if we didn't have hip hop? Can you imagine it? And, you know, I think that we've talked through this enough now that I'm pretty comfortable saying that none of those musical genres would be what they are today, but for the influence of cannabis.
Absolutely.
So, God, think about how much poorer our world would be, how much less rhythm and joy and dancing and beauty we would have if we didn't have cannabis. And then the way that in turn, each one of those cultural manifestations of cannabis has grown hugely popular all around the world, They're the most popular. We've just listed the most popular global musical forms that exist in the modern era. They all grew out of a base of cannabis, and then they all became a communication vector through which knowledge of cannabis was passed. So this thing that we're all a part of here is deeper and longer than most cannabis people around the world have realized, because that history's been so hidden from us. And to both of you, you know, I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about music now, but I think there's some other art forms, other cultural expressions that have been influenced by cannabis. Can you think of any of them that come to mind? Like, I'm thinking about like graffiti, maybe?
Yeah, well, you know, growing up in the streets in New York City, I mean, cannabis was just a part of the existence in New York, like my entire life growing up. And because of the heavy stigma placed on it, you had to be a lot more hush-hush, even though there was a lot more hush-hush, because once again, there were criminal ramifications, which still exist, with a disproportionate focus on people of color, but it still flourished, and it was just a thing that you just grew up. So one of the things that was interesting for me as a young kid, I went to a high school out in the Coney Island section of Brooklyn. And at the time, back then in the 70s, as graffiti was developing, my school was surrounded by the subway yards where the trains would be parked. And so I had also kind of figured out where my dad's stash was. So high school was a very cool period for me, because I was able to, I found my dad's stash, which I was able to tap into a little bit, increase my friend network in high school by, you know, getting under the bleachers and sharing with them, and then liberating some spray paint from the shop classes, and then going under the fence to do graffiti on the subways. And so it was all like a synonymous thing. Like, and then everything you did culturally, like, you wanted to get nice first, is one of the slangs we would use. Yo, we got to get nice. Let's chip in on a $5 bag. Whether that was going to the movies, that was a requisite as a kid growing up. So I have a close connection with all the all my creative pursuits, whether enjoying or making, cannabis is always an essential ingredient. And that's for most of the creatives that I know. Not all, but most.
An incredible story.
Even even with I carry on my father's legacy, which is always looking. We opened up a museum in 2016, but a lot of the direction that I take really comes from taking a moment to consume and meditate, and then you get that moment, that aha moment, that often comes with when you're under the influence, and you have this higher, this higher elevated mind state to kind of guide you and lead you in the right direction. And I think no matter, even in teaching, I taught in Boston Public Schools for 10 years, and you say, I think I'm going to do this lesson like this. And there's so many areas where creativity, even though it may not be teaching is not necessarily an art form, but it is, an art, to really be able to connect with children. And so I would, when I would create lesson plans and say, I want to, switch it up and find something that divine inspiration to maybe do something that's unconventional within the classroom. I think there's a lot of avenues that we can think of that really, that have creativity kind of at the foundation of it, and allow it to be that much more impactful in the work that you do. So running a nonprofit as well, it takes that that creative inspiration at the foundation, and then you kind of take it from there.
I just wanted to say, Niambe, I'm sure you know this guy, Wayne Jobson.
Yes.
Yeah, Wayne's an old friend of mine. He's a legendary Jamaican radio DJ, just super scholar. But he was involved, I believe, in the documentary about your dad. What was the name? Was it Red X?
Yes, it was Red X. That was done in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And so he did a great job. The documentary. It definitely is time for. We're working on a new documentary to kind of bring awareness. But it was he's a good friend of mine, and knew my dad well, and
yes,
and we connect every so often.
And so that was based on these tape recordings that your dad left, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yeah, he before he passed, a friend of his gave him a tape player that he could record into. He intended to just have it, possibly to write a book.
Right.
And he just would record whatever, whenever he felt inspiration, and record all of these recordings. And so then they took those recordings and created a documentary.
Yeah, I need to see that again. I just wanted to say what the interesting connection here, because Louie Armstrong did the exact same thing.
Oh, wow.
Louie, in fact, in my film Grass is Greener, we interviewed God, what's his name? I'm having a brain freeze moment. One of the cannabis experts in my film, whose name will come to me in a minute, who wrote the first book on reefer madness, is an early editor of High Times. We were interviewing in Louie Armstrong's former home, and the reel-to-reel tape recorder behind him in that scene was the reel-to-reel. Louie would pretty much, all his thoughts, he'd turn that tape recorder on and talk. There's literally hundreds of hours, and he quite a bit of him talking about cannabis and why he's being persecuted, because he was such a prominent musician, and he would be talking to his manager on the tape like, you got to get me a permit, because if people can have a license to have a gun, you mean I can't have a license to smoke this plant? This was way back 40s and 50s.
Wow.
And so that is a more effortless way to put your thoughts down, to record them. So that's interesting that two of our premier musical cannabis, just giants, were thinking in the same way.
Right. Wow, I didn't know that. That's a phenomenal story.
And that they were such deep thinkers and scholars, right?
Yes.
That they were, I believe, divinely inspired people who were on spiritual missions. And I think that that the breadth of their view reflects that. This has just been an amazing almost hour. We're getting down to the end of our time together. I think that some of the things that we've learned is that in many places, cannabis seemingly spontaneously has been a catalyst for artistic and creative expression. That contrary to the popularly received idea that Europeans were the ones who brought cannabis to North America in the form of industrial hemp, it is probably actually more true that cannabis, the type of cannabis that we smoke and consume, really came to us mostly through the hands of Africans and their descendants. I think that we've learned that out of this crucible of oppression, out of this crucible of bondage, right, and cannabis, that some of the most critical art forms that have moved the world, that continue to move the world today, emerged out of this cauldron.
Absolutely.
Jazz, reggae,
Yes.
hip hop, and if we think about what has happened just in this period of time with cannabis and artistic expression and creativity, imagine what we're going to be able to all do together over the course of the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. We're just getting started.
That's right.
So I do want to end just briefly by offering Fred. I'd like you to give us an opportunity. Just any new projects we should know about, man.
Well, a lot of interesting things working on. So one thing is, I just want to say, I'm developing a cannabis brand inspired by the story of Bernard Noble, which I feature in my film, and it's a real. Please watch the film if you haven't seen it. This man's story is representative of too many people put in prison. He was given 14 years for 2 joints of cannabis. And so we're developing a brand called Be Noble to help him and also to raise the awareness, connect him with what the work you're doing, Steve, with the Last Prisoner Project, the fact that there's still thousands and thousands of people in prisons across America for nonviolent cannabis offenses. I also just want to say, I just want to mention my dear friend, Ron Samuel, who was a brother that's been deeply involved in cannabis his entire life. And it was a conversation with him telling me he was going to start a company called 40 Acres and a Greenhouse in reference to the 40 acres that Black folks were promised after Reconstruction, which never really happened. And that conversation on the phone with him one night 3 years ago sparked the whole idea for the movie Grass is Greener. So he's been a big inspiration. He's involved with a company that's now producing cannabis, building a 100,000 square foot greenhouse in Zimbabwe to distribute medically throughout Europe. And it's just amazing the connections that I've made, the things that I've learned. And so that's really what I've been working on, as well as more film and TV projects and some incredible paintings. So that's really what I do. But Be Noble is a brand that's coming soon.
All right. And thanks so much. And I encourage everybody to stay in touch with Fred. If you love cannabis, he'll keep on laying interesting and new stuff on you, I'm sure, for years to come. Niambe, as director of the Peter Tosh Foundation, maybe you could fill us in a bit on your work there, what's going on with the brand. And then I'd just like to close out, if you could tell us how the Tosh family has been directly impacted by this really Holocaust against cannabis.
Right. Well, the Peter Tosh Foundation was founded in 2017, actually shortly after my brother's incident, and I'll get into information about that. And the purpose was really to continue with my father's mission. He was a Pan-Africanist. He also pushed for equal rights and justice, and also the wanted to impart the knowledge of cannabis and its benefits across the globe. And so we have 5 initiatives from the foundation. One is the museum, the Peter Tosh Museum and having proceeds to continue on having this place in Jamaica, in Kingston, Jamaica, that people can visit and learn about his legacy and his work. As well as we do have a Legalize It initiative, which is really geared at partnering with different organizations to have inclusivity within the cannabis industry, also to have education platform for cannabis as well. We have the Justice for Jorah initiative, which was founded on two-part for criminal justice reform, and then also there is proceeds. There's also a campaign geared about just raising funds for my brother's health and well-being as well. And then we have a global community initiative where we do more of different partnerships with small organizations across the globe that can help uplift communities, particularly as my father being a Pan-Africanist, looking for people of the diaspora of Africa and also in Africa itself. And so that's really the work that we focus on with the foundation. There is one more initiative called the Can't Blame the Youth initiative, which it's very important that we bridge the connection of my father's legacy and his teachings, all of those that I just mentioned, and passing that on to the next generation. So we do different initiatives where I personally go into schools and talk about my father's message, his impact, his music, and kind of help to really instill those values within young people as well. But for those that don't know about my brother, his name is Jorah Mcintosh. Musically, he's known as Tosh 1. When he was 37 in 2013, actually, wow. So he was a little bit younger. So in 2013, he was arrested for cannabis possession in New Jersey. He was held in Bergen County Jail for 6 months without a hearing. And after the hearing, he was then proposed to have a 20-year sentence. This is a man who is a Rastafarian father of 4, no prior offenses, nonviolent, very loving father, and activist within the community as well. And so he was released on bail a few months later. And then for about from 2013 to 2016, he had gone back and forth from Boston to New Jersey for pretrial motions. First them saying, okay, well, 20 years is the best we can offer. And then he was torn between really standing up for what he believes in as a freedom fighter and as an activist for the plant, but then also not wanting to be made an example of. And anybody that knows New Jersey's legacy when it comes to cannabis prohibition, they're very, very much antiquated. So although medical was legal in the state, they were still very much arresting people for minor cannabis offenses. And my brother, he did have what can be conceived for some as a lot of cannabis. It was several pounds, but it wasn't until 2016 where he finally said, you know what, I'm going to take a plea. And it got down to a plea offer of 5 years. And once he turned himself in January of 2017, he was incarcerated at Bergen County Jail in New Jersey for about a month and a half before being brutally attacked by another inmate, suffering a traumatic brain injury. Since then, he has been bedbound, unable to walk, talk, communicate, do anything with intent, needs 24-hour care. I actually am his primary caretaker along with my mom, but he lives here with me, and we have now turned to the plant also to help with his healing process, but the injuries are devastating and require a lot of care. And so we have launched from this the Justice for Jorah initiative, looking at really sharing his story in hopes to really have an impact on legislation that no one should be arrested or incarcerated over the plant, and it's time to really push for legalization. And so those that want to donate to the initiative, they can go to the petertoshfoundation.org and or justiceforjawara.org. It's JAWARA, and donate either to the cause of educating people around the impacts of prohibition, or directly to his medical care. So that is the work that I do now.
Thanks for sharing that, Niambe. And in my view, this is one of the most outrageous outrages that I've heard of in the world of cannabis. And I've been around for 50 years, so I've seen a lot of them. But the idea that one of our heroes, one of our prophets, one of our great teachers' son should be subjected to what he has been subjected to, just being arrested in the first place at a time when there were other people who were being allowed to sell cannabis, and then being put into a facility where this kind of horror can happen. So if in my opinion, the global cannabis community has a sacred obligation to make sure that all of these initiatives of the Tosh family are well funded, that all of us need to make sure that when we go to Kingston, we make a pilgrimage to the Peter Tosh Museum, that we all collectively make sure that there will be justice for Jorah. And if you live in one of the places around the world where thankfully, finally, long overdue, we're seeing the statues, the honoring of these horrible racist slave traders, Confederate generals, finally tumbling down, let's make sure that those statues are replaced by people, our heroes, our prophets, like Peter Tosh.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. This has been great, Steve. And I'm so sorry to hear about that. And wow, unbelievable horror. And I will clearly do what I can do as well.
Thank you.
All right. Friends, thank you so much for tuning into Radio Free Cannabis. Niambe, Fred, thank you for bringing your wisdom and your soul and your thoughts to this show, to our audience, and stay tuned every Sunday.
Right. Thanks for this great work that you do, Steve. We really appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you. Your work is amazing, and of course, this is not going to be the last time we connect. So I'm looking forward to an ongoing relationship, and a pleasure to meet you as well, Freddy.
Yes, likewise, Niambe. Absolutely. This has been special. Great way to spend my afternoon.
Exactly.
Yes. Positive energy is what we need, because as soon as I turn on the news, it's going to be more nightmarish madness. But I love a good fight, and I'm ready, goddammit.
Yeah.
Bring it. Taking it to the street. And tomorrow's Juneteenth, and I'll be out there in Harlem. Big demonstrations going on. I know this will be a little after, but that's how we doing it, baby.
Awesome.
Can't stop, won't stop. Thanks, Steve.